Today I have the pleasure of speaking with Dave Bidini, and what can I say about Dave Bidini? I first became familiar with Mr. Bidini as part of a trio of really wonderful songwriters who fronted a band that billed itself as the founders of Etobicoke art rock, the Rheostatics. They're great. Get a copy of Whale Music, put on some headphones and listen to it. It will take you places you've never been before. But both before, during, and after his 27-year career with the Rheostatics, Dave was also nurturing a career as a writer, beginning in high school, working up through college, up through until about 1998 when he published his first book, and the last 14 years when he has published 10 books, and how he has done that. That's better than Anne
Dave
Rice.
Bidini, thank you for dropping into exchanging notes.
Yeah.
Thanks.
That's interesting. Now, and for those about to write, you talked
Yes.
about the blue chord in jazz. Is
Right.
it called the blue chord? And
Blue
it's,
note.
It's the
Yeah.
blue note.
Yeah.
And it's sort of a dissonant chord. And it's the one thing, if you're listening to a jazz solo, the
Right.
one note that will grab you is the blue note.
Right.
Is that like an idea that's guided you? The Rheostatics were
Sure.
very blue notish. They'd get loud, they'd get soft. It wasn't like bang, bang, bang.
I think in a literary sense too. I think it's actually quite instructive for people who are working on their literature. When I was writing Tropic of Hockey, my second book, I was struggling. I think, sat in the middle of the book, and I was struggling to build that bridge between the beginning of the book and the end of the book. And I'd written myself into a standstill in a lot of ways, trying to get it perfect. And my friend Paul Steenhausen, who's internationally famous new music composer, he pointed that out. He said, like, the most kind of alluring moments in the solos of Miles Davis, for instance, are where he, finds himself in a dark alley and has to work himself through it, and that's where the journey of the composition becomes interesting. Mm-hmm. And while he's playing, when you're in the moment, when you're creating, it's all spilling out. The good and the bad is spilling out. The blue and the red is all kind of coming out at once. And I think if you worry about the proportion of the two, then you kind of get stuck. One has to exist without the other. So I just sort of tried to get into sort of the unconscious state, the zen of storytelling. And making sure the story was told in a true sense, as opposed to whether it was told. That's when a big turning point for me in literature and my work was when I was in Ireland. I tell the story in On a Cold Road, but when I was in Ireland, a friend had made me a tape that had Stompin' Tom Connors on one side and the band on the other side. So when people would come over to my little apartment at Trinity College and ask me what Canada was like, I would just play them Stompin' Tom. And that was like, for me, I was so grateful to have that. But as a 22-year-old Canadian in 1980, this is the 80s too, where our sense of self-identity as Canadians is still being formed, but back then it was very nascent. And so I was forced to explain to the Irish what Canada was like, mm-hmm. and I used Stompin' Tom as a way of explaining that. So when I came back to Canada, I became curious about him, because I never really heard about him until my friend gave me this tape. And so when I came back to Canada, I decided to go looking for him, and I found that he had removed himself from public. He'd gone into self-imposed exile to protest the practices at the Canadian National Exhibition, right?
He handed back his Juno.
He handed back his box of Junos, yeah. And so there was a local paper, a rock and roll paper called The Eye, I think, and I decided to just hang around Boot Records in Mississauga, which was his record label, and just to see if I could get, old press clippings and recordings, because I didn't have any records of his at the time. And I got to know the secretary really well, and I was going there once a week. And when I went out there for one visit, she showed me this letter that she was writing to Richard Hatfield, who was the premier of New Brunswick at the
mm-hmm.
time. And it was a letter inviting him to celebrate Stompin' Tom's 50th birthday party at a community hall in Balnafad, which is in Halton Hills. And I wrote down the address, and then a week later, we showed up at this party. And there was a guy outside having a cigarette, and I said, Stompin' Tom in there, and he was like, yeah, I'll go get him for you. So, but at this point in my mind, I admired him so much for being, taking this sort of proto-Canadian stance, and again, removing himself from music to protest the way the industry treated Canadian musicians. But anyways, he came out, and he's a very tall man. He has like cowboy hat on, He had, you know, a vest, and he just looked. He was really like a figure from my imagination come to life. And I remember I said to him, you know, I'm here to represent, you know, like the youth of Canada. We want you to come back. Canada needs you. I had a petition in my back pocket that I gave him.
How many signatures?
Like 100 signatures or something. I had a cassette tape of our band that I gave to him, which it turned out wasn't even. I thought it was a cassette tape of our band, but it was actually a tape of Patti Smith doing Joe in This Factory. So I gave him this, and I went on this long spiel that I'd rehearsed for 2 weeks about it, and he looked at me. He asked us where we were from. We said Toronto. I said, Toronto, you might as well come in and have a few drinks. So he brought us into this small hall where you know, Bud the Spud was there, the actual Bud the Spud.
Really, the original Bud?
Yeah, and Tom came over.
Maggie there?
What's that?
Maggie's got
No, that was later on. But
Margo's got
but all of his old band was there, and Richard Hatfield was there, and all these interesting people. It was all of Canada. It was like, you know, a certain era of Canada was all there in this one hall. And so I went and I wrote that story. And after I wrote about this kind of this personal odyssey of mine, meeting my hero, it you know, people would come up to me on the street and tell me they'd read it and how they'd cried when they'd read it and how affected they were. And that in a way became, I ended up writing for the Star out of that, and I think that was my calling card.
It's was it different for you? Did you feel different sitting down to writing fiction as opposed to nonfiction? You've done mostly nonfiction.
It's hard. It's a lot harder.
Really?
It's more to me. Just because I don't do it a lot, it takes more of a commitment is sort of applied.
More of a focus.
Well, you just more commitment. I've written like I have tons of 3-chapter novels, and then I just I get tired. So, and with nonfiction, whatever, it's all like all the plug of clay is there. I just have to shape it. Yeah. But in fiction, you actually have to make the clay.
So you just find the work easier in nonfiction.
Pretty much.
So you're basically just telling us that you don't write fiction because you're lazy.
Probably. Yeah. Oh, yeah. I wouldn't deny that.
Well, there's the admission we've been waiting
Every
for.
artist is lazy.